All right, so what we're going to talk about today are three critical concepts that staffing owners need to understand before selling their firm. And as I just said, these are concepts that even if you're saying, yes, selling my business, that's decades in the future, you will run your business so much better looking at these things today. And one other little thing I observed is you start to look at expenses very critically because you realize that every dollar you spend is costing you, 4 times more that amount when you go to sell. So today, Marty, you're here to talk to us about this. So if you wouldn't mind, just give everybody a little introduction to yourself and your background.
Sure, would love to. So like you indicated, David, I run the staffing industry practice group at Becker. And we have the pleasure of working with over 100 brands across the country. And my focus and the reason you were at that event of ours is I focus on industry mergers and acquisitions. And that's all I really do. That's all I've done for the last decade, and kind of a geek about it. And so loves trying to share information, love trying to learn information, and was really excited to come talk to you today because this is a little bit different spin on this topic, which I'm excited to really present. And I think you hit the key concept right at the beginning. And it's a pretty famous business saying. It's start with the end in mind, right? And so that's really the foundation of what we're going to talk about here. And we're going to talk about some pretty simple concepts that when you start digging beneath the surface of them can get quite complex and can really impact the ending, right? And the ending is for most people when they sell their company. And so if you're impacting the ending, you're impacting the dollars that people put in their pocket when they sell the company. So great title you came up with. And to me, there's three critical concepts we're going to talk about. And I'm excited to do it.
Thank you. Before we jump into the meat of the presentation, just for everybody listening, Marty, when you just said start with the end in mind, somebody said, and I think it was at your conference last spring, every owner is going to sell their company at some point. Nobody takes their business to the grave with them. So you're going to sell it because you want out, you want to retire, and you're going to find a buyer. You may turn it over to another family member. You may sell it to your leadership team. There are lots of different ways you can sell, but what you want to do it is under your terms and conditions. I had a friend in graduate school who sort of went through this process. He wasn't in the staffing industry. His dad owned a manufacturing company, and I think it was less than a month into year one of his MBA program, dad passed away. And they had no plans for transition. They hadn't thought about it. And he had to drop out of school to try to go save the family business because people came in to buy like vultures and were offering him less than 30 cents on the dollar to buy his family business. And so it's so important to plan ahead and to think about this stuff. So let's keep moving forward. I know, Marty, I'm gonna let you read this one because this comes from you. You're our resident attorney in the room.
We're going to have a great conversation, David. We're going to talk about a lot of things. And in this type of format, folks should understand that we're not giving advice. We're giving general statements. And if they need actual advice, they need to contact and have a formal conversation with their professionals. So it's as easy as that.
Awesome. Thanks, Marty. All right. So, we're going to talk about what every staffing owner needs to understand before you go to market, things you want to start looking at today. Marty, I'll let you do the introduction here. Why don't you walk us through this slide?
Sure, sure. Look, there's three critical kind of concepts that you need to understand. And it starts with the math. So the first thing you need to understand is what is the math that determines what your company is worth and how much of that value that you can put into your pocket. So it all starts from understanding that math, because once you understand that math, then you start to understand the concepts that impact that math, that influence the math in a positive and a negative fashion. And then once you understand the concepts that influence the math in a positive and negative fashion, well, then you can start to make changes so that you can have a positive impact on the math. And so again, those are the three critical concepts: the math, what impacts the math, and how do we influence that math that we're going to try and cover today.
All right, and we promise everybody there will be no math problems at the end of today's exercise. It's just about learning how the calculations work. Okay, so it's math. Don't run away if you don't like math, because that's why you get into sales and recruiting and staffing. But let's talk about the math evaluations.
Sure, sure. So the big thing that to me I want to start out with, David, is that, unfortunately, um, there are times where owners start down this process without understanding the math, and I think it's important to understand what impact that can have, because what happens when you don't understand the math, or you're misinformed about the math, well, your decision making can be impacted, right? And you can end up making poor decisions. And so I see this quite often. And what I've seen is that folks that start the process too soon because they don't understand the math. Folks that get into the process and are far into the process and are stuck in the process and end up having to accept an outcome that's not a great outcome. So what I like folks to understand that the process of selling your company, it's just unfortunately a long and frankly painful process. I try and make the analogy to building a house. Anybody who's built a house, I haven't, but has told me is a painful process. And what happens is if you're not really involved in the building of the house and you don't go and look at the house and what's being built until 9 months in, 10 months in, or you're misinformed or don't understand what the house is going to look like, well, 9 months in, 10 months in, you look at the house and you can be disappointed, right? So understanding the math helps you make the decisions. So let's talk about the math. And there's two aspects of the math. There's the valuation aspect, and that's the math that's going to determine how much your staffing firm is worth. And then there is the additions and subtractions to the value of the company that determine what you put in your pocket at the end of the day. So those are the two components of the math. Now, with respect to the first component, it's a formula, and it's a pretty simple formula at its basic level. Most staffing firms, and I'll talk about exceptions in a couple seconds, most staffing firms are valued under a particular formula, and that is what's called a multiple times the company's EBITDA. There are some exceptions. If you are a direct hire only staffing firm, you may be valued under that formula, or you might be valued under a formula relating to your revenue. But for purposes of today, we're going to talk about the majority of the staffing firms out there and how they're valued, and that is a multiple times EBITDA. And so there's two elements. There's the multiple, and then there's EBITDA. Probably a lot of people out here, this is talked about a lot, especially when you have investment bankers as part of this conversations. What is the multiple? What's it going to be? How do we determine that? So this part of our conversation, some folks may have heard before, but the multiple is really influenced by a couple things. The multiple is influenced by your financial performance. Usually the greater your revenue, the higher your EBITDA, the better your gross margin compared to other folks and competitors. And the more that the current state of your performance, are you growing? Are you stagnant? Are you declining? That's going to have an impact on your multiple. Then the other thing that has an impact on your multiple is what sector do you serve? So, in our industry, there's so many different subsectors that staffing firms can serve. If you're an IT staffing firm, you're going to have one range of multiples. If you're, a professional staffing firm, you're going to have another range of multiples. If you're a light industrial staffing firm, yet another range of multiples. So for each different sector that you're servicing, that also influences your multiples. So, and then we talk about EBITDA. EBITDA, of course, is an accounting principle. And, it's a formula. It's earnings or profit before consideration of interest, taxes, depreciation, and amortization. And so those are the two big components of value. And what's important about EBITDA and what some folks don't realize is that when you go to sale, you're allowed to do what's called is normalize your EBITDA. And that is that you can take out certain items that are in your financial statement for your earnings. You can change those or adjust those to normalize your EBITDA. And those adjustments can have tremendous impact on the value of your company. And it's really important as we're talking about understanding the math. It's really important to understand those adjustments because I've worked with a number of clients who either didn't understand that their EBITDA was subject to adjustment or understood that and interpreted it in a very aggressive way, and therefore were proceeding towards a sale thinking that they were going to have maybe $1 million in positive adjustments to their EBITDA, when really they were only going to have maybe $150,000 or $200,000 of positive adjustments to their EBITDA. So understanding the adjustments is critical, and let's talk about some of the categories where we can have these adjustments. One category,
Marty, if I can interject for a second
yeah,
before
please.
before we get into some of the areas for normalizing the adjustments, I have a couple of questions based on the first bit of information. So you talked about the process being long. And I know there's no one right answer to how long does it take, but what have you seen is when the companies begin to get into the active sale of their business to the time the deal is closed, what is a typical range?
You're talking from an incredibly short period of time of 6 months to a normal period of time of 9 months to 12 months. And then, of course, it can be longer than that as well, depending on, the particular circumstances of the deal.
So if somebody's running their business today and they're thinking, yeah, I want to sell in a couple of years, but when we get to the sales process, I don't want to drawn out for the year. What can they do to accelerate the process?
Well, you can start to prepare in advance, and towards the end of this discussion, I have, for example, some charts and that I'm going to pull up that show material and information in the way that buyers requested it and want to see it. So you can start to put the information into that format, understand it in advance, and that can speed up the process. The reason if you're just stepping back, if you think about the reason that the process takes so long is, a buyer is not familiar with your company. They're not there every day running it, right? And to buy it, it's a big commitment. So they really want to take the time to understand as much as they can about the company. And it just makes it a long process. So preparing in advance with your professionals, you can help, be what a buyer calls very buttoned up and be able to hand them the information that they know that that they need, and that can speed up the process. So it's all about preparation, David, to speed up the process.
Excellent. The second question I had on EBITDA, and I think you may be addressing this later, is I've heard that very often sellers tend to have inflated or unrealistic expectations of value. So when you're thinking about EBITDA, you said there's already a range, but what's the low end and what's the high end? And later on, we're going to get into some of what drives the differences.
Right. And that is one of the big problems, is that the sellers are not informed, and they think that the value of their company is going to be a lot greater than it is. And most of the times they make the mistake in two categories. One is they think that they're going to get a multiple that isn't realistic, right? Because they heard their friend who's in IT staffing sold their company for 6.5 times EBITDA, and they're in light industrial staffing, and the multiples are lower as a general rule in light industrial. Or they heard that their IT staffing friends sold their firm, but that firm was 5, 6, 7 times larger than their firm. So they make a mistake about the multiple, and they don't get informed about that. And then the second thing is they don't understand what their adjusted EBITDA is going to be, and they inflate it. And those are the two common mistakes that cause owners to think that they're going to end up with a greater valuation than they really are.
All right, thanks. Well, that's a great segue. So let's talk a little bit more about those normalizing adjustments. I see we've got 3 categories up on the screen, but why don't you walk us through the adjustments that buyers are going to make?
Yeah, so there's three categories: non-reoccurring expenses, owner-related expenses, and related party transactions. And let's talk about what's typical in the staffing industry, because each industry, I only work in staffing, but I have a partner who does a lot of M&A in manufacturing, and the adjustments that a manufacturing company will have to their EBITDA is different than what a staffing firm is going to have. So what's normal in a staffing firm? So what would be normal non-reoccurring expenses that you can get the benefit of? In a staffing firm, you might have opened a new office in the year that you're going to sell, or you might have closed an office in the year that you're going to sell. And in the process of opening an office or closing an office, you're going to have some expenses associated with that are not normal reoccurring expenses of the business. And so those can be adjusted positively in your favor to improve your EBITDA. Similar to that, you may have a litigation that you're defending, and you've got professional fees that you're expending, or you might be one of those folks that's really doing a great job of preparing to go to market. And so you've got, professional expenses associated with preparing for your sale. Well, those are non-reoccurring expenses, and they can be adjusted as well. You could have a write-off, a client AR, a client that went bankrupt. Right now, a lot of our healthcare staffing firms are starting to worry about the solvency of hospitals, and again, because a lot of the COVID related economics and positive impact that have gone away, and hospitals are struggling in certain areas. So you could have an accounts receivable that you don't collect, and that's not a normal occurring, so you would have a credit there. So those are the type of examples most commonly see in terms of non-reoccurring expenses for staffing firms. Owner-related expenses, this is probably the biggest category of adjustments that can be made. And understand that adjustments can be positive and negative. For the most part, they end up being positive, but there can be negative adjustments. And owner-related expenses, how much you pay yourself. A lot of owners, they work really hard. They have very successful companies. They're able to pay themselves incredible salaries and bonuses. And it's deserved. But that may not be market for somebody doing that position. So if you were to hire a CEO to replace the owner, what you would pay the CEO might be considerably less. The owner may be taking out $500,000 a year, but given the size of the company and the staffing firm, a CEO from the market might be $250,000. So you'd get a $250,000 positive adjustment to your EBITDA because the owner will be going away in theory, and that sum of compensation going away. And so that's another common adjustment. Sometimes owners are able to take incidental benefits, memberships. Some of our clients, they have country club memberships or other memberships that the company pays for because they have benefit to the company. Those expenses can be adjusted. So you have owner-related expenses. That's one of the biggest categories of adjustments. That is a way to positively impact. And then Sometimes you have related party transactions. The most common would be family members working for the staffing firm in incidental roles that the owner is able to pay them way above market, or family members that the position is not going to be continued under the buyer. So quite often you'll have family members in the business, and the compensation that they received is also an adjustment. Occasionally we have staffing firm owners who own the real estate. You know, I've had one recently who owned 4 buildings, and the office and the staffing firm rented from that person. If the rent is not market, you could have an adjustment there. But those are the main categories and examples of adjustments that occur. And the big thing about the adjustments, David, is they can have a gigantic impact on what the value of your company is. And
Yeah.
so I have an example that I think I put in there for you, and maybe we can kind of walk through that example. And it just, I think, shows the tremendous impact that can happen. So, you know, example I gave was a hypothetical example of an IT staffing firm that had $2.1 million in unadjusted EBITDA, and the multiple for this staffing firm was going to be 6.5 times. So, you know, if you do the quick math of 2.1 times 6.5 times, you get a value of $13,650,000. Okay. Now, if the company did a proper look at what adjustments it had, hypothetically, this company had some owner's compensation that was above market. It had one-time professional expenses to prepare for the sale, and it had family members that were working for the company. And the math said that the earnings could be adjusted by $525,000, and the buyer would accept that. And so you redo the math. You add that 525,000 to the $2.1 million in EBITDA, and suddenly you have an adjusted EBITDA of $2,625,000. Now you multiply that times 6.5, and wow, the company is worth over $17 million. And so why is adjusted EBITDA so important to get correct in the math? Because it's multiplied. Every dollar of positive adjusted EBITDA is multiplied in our example by 6.5 times. Very important that as you understand the math, you understand what are normal adjustments, not exaggerated adjustments, and you have that at your fingertips so that you really understand what the value of a company is going to be. And my warning is just so many folks, when they hear that there can be adjustments to their EBITDA, when they hear that that's multiplied when they sell the company, well, now they want adjustments for everything, right? And so they go into the sale.
I didn't need that electricity to run the company.
Yeah, exactly. Where they feel like they're going to get just, they're going to make up savings that the buyer's getting, and they're going to over exaggerate what the adjusted EBITDA is going to be, and they end up disappointed. Because not every dollar that a buyer saves is the seller entitled to an adjustment for EBITDA. So that's my warning. A lot of folks hear this, they get super excited because it can make a material difference, but then they get carried away.
So a couple of questions for you in regard to this. First question is related to the time frame for the EBITDA, because in the first slide you mentioned the TTM, or trailing 12 months. Do buyers look back further than the last 12 months, or is it almost always no, it's just the last 12 months of performance?
So typically in a sales process, you're going to go through what is an LOI process, so getting to a letter of intent. And for that letter of intent, often, again, each transaction is slightly different. Often there will be a base value put on the company. Sometimes it's just a multiple. So if there's a base value put on the company, you're going to look at the trailing 12 months from that letter of intent, and a base value will be put on the company there. But always, as you move from the LOI towards the closing date, the date you're going to sell, you're getting new financial information each month. Always the buyer is going to do their final determination of value based on the trailing 12 months, what the EBITDA and the adjusted EBITDA are, and they're going to look at that. And if it's close to what was on the LOI, then they're going to move forward. If it is disparate from what was on the LOI, they're going to ask for an adjustment. So it's always a trailing 12 months from the closing. Sometimes it's pegged a little bit earlier in the process and then just double checked.
So related to that, last year was a rough year for a lot of staffing companies, or this year, I should say. So sometime around late 2023, the market turned down, and it's been a struggle since. If your business went down, but now you're trending back up, you're kind of going to where you were, maybe end of 2022 to middle of 2023, and you're showing this positive trend, but trailing 12 months is still down compared to where you were. Are you better off waiting to sell, or do you talk to a buyer about this, saying, hey, yeah, of course we had this. The staffing industry was down 13% this year. We were only down 6%, and now we're back up to even. So we want to be valued on, where we were, not necessarily just this bad year. How would you convince a buyer to look at or to reduce the impact of a negative economic cycle if you're only looking at 12 months?
Yeah, so great question. And there's a couple different answers, David. One is, again, understanding your numbers and your trends. One important thing that sellers want to have available to buyers is projections, right? And so you have your projections and you hand those to the buyers, and you show them why this current trend, the last 3 months, is going to be, the permanent trend versus what you saw before. Again, when you do that, you have to use real math, right? Buyers are bright. Buyers are usually in the industry, or there are financial buyers like private equity firms or family offices or very sophisticated investors, and they see projections in every deal they do, and they know what projections are realistic and what projections are not realistic. So again, just like we had that conversation about exaggerated adjustments to EBITDA, an exaggerated projection isn't going to be helpful either. Because what happens is, again, if we talk about the LOI and progressing 6 months, well, if you've got a projection, the buyer's going to get to look at that projection and see the numbers coming in. And if you were projecting for March something and March comes in and it's nowhere near that, okay. Then you go to April and April comes in and it's nowhere near that, okay. So yes, you can use projections, you can use current trends to help justify a change in the valuation. But buyers are going to be skeptical. And what typically happens in those situations is something called an earnout. And an earnout becomes part of the valuation of the company. And the earnout is, in fact, that if you hit these projections that you're claiming, if your company is really trending in that way, well, then you'll earn the rest of your purchase price. And if you don't, you won't earn the rest of your purchase price, and the buyer will have only paid you the amount that was based on your trailing 12-month performance.
Makes sense. And then my last question is, Sarah, that I heard on a podcast last year. I was listening to somebody, not from the staffing industry, but from the M&A world. And one of her recommendations was that if you have a lot of the adjustment for owner's compensation, not just your salary, but perks, things you're running through the business that aren't necessarily business expenses like the country club membership that you mentioned. She had recommended setting up a management holding company, and that you put all of your personal expenses through that, and then that company bills your main business. So when you get to talking to a buyer, it's really easy to back out everything that's just personal and not have to haggle over it. Is that something you would recommend, is try to create that easy separation?
The clarity is really important. One of the points that I wanted to make at some point in this chat we're having was that having financials and financial statements that are accurate, that are detailed, that help show the buyer important information in easy ways, really, really critical to this process. So doing something like she recommend is a great solution for putting all of these owner-related expenses into one bucket that's really easy to see and less to debate about. So yes, I do like that idea, and you can do it in that fashion, or there's other fashions to do it. But yes, that putting things in buckets that are easy to identify, where you can hand it over on a silver plate to the buyer, they can look at it and say, yes, easy. That's very helpful. That speeds up the process, and it makes for a much better process.
Yeah, and for everybody listening, if you think about it, when you're selling, the easier you make it for a buyer of staffing services to buy from you, the more successful you're going to be. The same thing comes when you're selling your company. The easier you make it for an acquirer, the more likely you are to be successful.
Exactly.
All right, let's keep talking about the math. Now we're going to get into talking about take home versus what the amount was they promised you.
Right. So we talked about the first half of the equation. What's the value of your company? But you don't take home, unfortunately, the entire value of the company. There are a number of subtractions, some that are pretty obvious and everybody understands, and some that are pretty complicated and few people understand, and you really need your professional accountants, investment bankers, and folks to help you with. So let's take a look at some of these subtractions. When you talk about subtractions, when you sell your company, 98% of the time, the buyer is going to require you to pay all of what's called your indebtedness. They are not going to take over your debt. And so at its basic level, that seems pretty obvious and seems pretty simple. So it means if you have a bank financing, right, whether it be a line of credit, whether it be an asset-based facility, whether it be a factoring facility, if you've got debt to a financial institution, you're going to have to pay that at closing. Similarly, if you have government-sponsored debt, SBA loans, EDIL loans, very few of these anymore, but outstanding PPP loans, any government-related financing, also going to have to be paid at closing. Again, that most folks, that makes sense, and they're aware of that, but just that has to go into the math. So you get your value, you're going to subtract your indebtedness. What some folks don't realize is that there are other items that most sophisticated buyers are going to term indebtedness. And in our industry, the biggest example of this is what we would call GAAP accrued employee-related expenses. And so, in our industry, we have two pools of employees, right? We have our internal workforce and we have our contingent workforce. And both of those under GAAP, you should be accruing certain expenses to. And what would they be? PTO. Depending on how you've structured your PTO policies for your internal employees and your contingent workforce, you could have under GAAP a requirement that you're accruing the PTO that you owe your employees. 401k, not so often obviously with the contingent workforces, but quite often with the internal workforces. You could have some type of 401k, some type of simple plan, some type of retirement plan. There can be a matching element to that plan. And under GAAP, you should have accrued the matching that is owed to employees. Certain types of bonuses sometimes require accrual. Certain types of commissions, not often in staffing, most of the way that commissions are structured, there isn't much of an accrued element to it under GAAP, but with some firms that have really complicated commission structures, Under GAAP, there could be some accrued expenses. So those you're going to have to pay. You're going to have to pay those at closing. And so, again, when we say start to understand the math, understand what those are. If you're not GAAP, or most staffing firms, mid-size, family-run staffing firms, they're not GAAP. So understand what these GAAP accrued expenses are. In some cases, like PTO, you can make changes to your policies if you have your policies right, and the way that your handbooks are, and the way that you offer your PTO to your internal workforces and your contingent workforces. If that's structured right, you may not have any accrued liability here. But that's an element of indebtedness people often overlook, and can be material in dollars. So you've got your debt. Then you've got something known as your transaction expenses. That's your professional fees, your investment banker, your business broker, your accountants, your attorneys. All of that is going to have to be paid at closing. The 9 out of 10 buyers will not allow you to pay that post-closing. Also, with respect to that, sometimes there are bonuses or phantom stock plans or some type of long-term incentive compensation plans that you've promised to a key employee or a group of key employees. Those are considered a transaction expense. So I just had a deal where one of the key employees was promised roughly 5% of the money that the owner was going to put in their pocket. So that had to be paid as a transaction expense. So you're going to subtract your indebtedness, you're going to subtract your transaction expenses, and it's important to understand what that is, and to get an idea of what that is in advance. A positive in almost every deal, you're going to be able to keep your cash. So whatever cash you have in your bank account at the closing is going to go into your pocket. You've likely already paid taxes on that, so it's not going to be taxed. So if you've got $1 million of cash in your accounts, that goes into your pocket at closing, and that's the one usual addition that you get when we do this half of the math. And then very complicated, and we won't have the time to really talk about this in detail now. A lot of confusion about receivables and whether or not you get to keep your receivables in a transaction. A lot of folks go into a transaction thinking that they can keep their cash and their receivables, and that may not be the case. In smaller transactions, again, this is just a rule of thumb, this is not an absolute. Transactions where the staffing firm is valued at $5 million or less, often, not always, you may be able to negotiate keeping your receivables in that situation. Staffing firms with a value of $5 million or more, very unlikely you're going to be able to keep your accounts receivable. What is going to happen is the buyer is going to require you to give something that's called adequate working capital. And adequate working capital is a delta between your normal accounts receivable and your normal payables, your trade payables. And that delta you'll be required to provide to the buyer at closing. If you provide less than that delta, you're going to owe the buyer some money, which will be subtracted from the purchase price. If you provide more than that delta, then you will get paid that like it was cash at closing. So understanding these numbers, really important. Indebtedness is very important. Most people don't understand working capital. So really having a conversation with professionals who can give you advice as to whether or not they think you're going to be required to give working capital and what that might be. Really significant items can literally be hundreds of thousands, sometimes millions of dollars in deals difference. So again, this is the second part of the math that you really should understand before you go to sale, so that you can influence the math as you move closer to sale.
Yeah, Martin, one of the things like jumps out at me is like you could have somebody come in and on paper it looks like they're giving you a great offer, but in the fine print they're keeping the cash and receivables. So that's a big difference from cash free, debt free, where you're walking away with that cash, you're walking away with your receivables, you're paying off the debts you have, and then the number they give you is in addition to that reconciliation. A
Yeah,
lot of nuances to what's in the terms of the deal, not just the amount that somebody's offering you. So if somebody, if you're an owner of a business, you probably have people every single day reaching out saying, "Hey, we've got people looking to buy companies in your industry, and we've got these great buyers, and we're going to give you these incredible prices." But it's definitely buyer beware, or as we'll get to the end, get your professionals involved. Well, let's take a look at an example, Marty, then of some of
yep.
this.
Yeah, let's do that. And again, we're going to roll forward the example we used before, and we're going to use that IT staffing firm that had a value of $17 million after we made the EBITDA adjustments. And we're going to go through and we're going to say they had $1.2 million in cash. They had debt to a bank in 4.6 million. They had $175,000 in accrued debt to employees. I didn't put a transaction expense number in here, but that would have to be subtracted from here. And so if you look below, you got that 17 million minus the 475. That means that they're actually putting in their pocket 12 million roughly. And then of course you have taxes. So, and the way you structure a transaction can have an impact on taxes. So understanding with your accountants what your tax burden is likely to be under different scenarios, very important. But here I use the blended tax rate of 28%. And so the owner puts in their pocket 8.8 million versus 17 million, right? Quite a difference. Neither one a bad number, obviously, but quite a difference. Of course, in this case, we said they had $1.2 million in cash. So you would add that $1.2 million in cash, and this the seller would take home, just over $10 million. And your point exactly, I am always surprised at, I'm not surprised if people don't do these equations now, a year, 2 years out. They should. You really should. But I am so surprised at how many sellers get so close to the end of the transaction and they haven't done all this math, right? And it's rare, but there's something called a flow of funds. There's a lot of math that goes at the closing of one of these transactions. And I had one deal, and that math usually circulates 48, 72 hours, 48 hours, 24 hours, or 5 minutes before the closing, depending on how hectic everything is. And I've had a seller who didn't understand the math until they got that document, right? And said, holy cow, that's all I'm going to put in my pocket right now. And so again, just so important to do this math early. You're not going to understand all of it, but to understand enough so that you can have intelligent conversations with your professionals and intelligent conversations with the prospective buyers about these items.
Yeah, two stories came to mind when I'm looking at the tax number. I met a gentleman a few years ago, not in the staffing industry. He had just sold a fairly big business. I think he was in the cannabis industry, and he had moved to Puerto Rico. And he moved to Puerto Rico. Like, why did you? He was from Seattle. Like, why did you move to Puerto Rico? And he goes, because if I live here for 3 years and I don't enter the United States, I don't pay any federal taxes on the sale of my business. So I just took on the highest paying job I've ever had, and I just can't work for the next 3 years in the US. So interesting challenge. I had another friend who sold his business outside of staffing, and he was in New York State and wanted to avoid New York State taxes, and he had to be out of the United States for 360 out of 454 days. So he and his wife had a great, amazing year and a half traveling around the world. But by the time it was over, he's like, I'm not sure it was worth what I saved. So, but
Right.
there are considerations, and just like the example here, you've got a massive swing due to taxes. There are lifestyle considerations you might make at the end of the transaction. All right, let's take a look at some more ways to influence the math positively.
Sure. So some of this will be, pretty intuitive for folks, and they're probably already aware of it. But you got positive and negative influences. I'm gonna put them both together because I know we're not out of time, but time is growing short. And so these are things that will adjust the multiple mostly. We talked about ways you can adjust EBITDA. These are mostly going to be adjustments to the multiple, and that of course makes them quite significant because that's what you're going to be multiplying your EBITDA by. One is the size, it's your financial performance. So again, the bigger you are, the better your trend is, the better your gross margin is compared to other firms that do the same thing. That's going to really influence your multiple in a positive way. If you're larger, if you're growing, you can have a real positive impact on your multiple. Then second set of results, they're going to look at your customers, the diversity of your customers, the mix of your customers, the relationship you have with your customers, how long-term your customers are, a lot of scrutiny of your customers. And depending on what that looks like, that can have a tremendous impact in a positive or a negative way. So if you have what's known as a high customer concentration, so the majority of your revenue comes from one or two or three customers, that can have a negative impact on the valuation of your company. It's not always easy to fix. Or, if somebody says that, and then you get all these professionals who go out and say, "Oh, you have to fix your customer concentration." Okay, yeah, that would be great, and you should try to, but obviously it's not the easiest thing to fix. So, do your best to try and fix your customer concentration. And then the last thing is really your talent. Well, not the last thing. Second to last thing is really your talent. And buyers are interested in your talent. It's hard to find talented folks these days. And, we work with a lot of buyers in the industry, and one of the most important things that they're looking for is the talent of the seller. Is there talent there? Is it talent that they're going to be able to bring over? So having talent and secured talent, really important. Then we talked about the financials, David. Being able to present the information, for the information to make sense, for the information to be understandable, for the information to be accurate. The more you can spoon feed a buyer, the more comfortable a buyer gets, the more comfortable they get with a decision, the more comfortable they get with the time of making a decision. So, really important early on to work with your accounting professionals and to button up your financial statements and your internal accounting, and to be able to go to market with that in very good shape. And then the last thing is compliance-related issues, tax compliance, and we're in the people industry, so we're dealing with people. We've got so many regulations in the area of employment of people today. So offboarding and onboarding processes that are compliant, that are uniform, that are documented, your compliance. And I like to circle this back to kind of two bigger concepts. When you're selling a staff firm, I always have this conversation with my partner who does M&A in manufacturing, because the assets in a staffing firm are so much different than the assets in a manufacturing company,
Sure.
right? And so in staffing, you have really two assets. You have your contracts, and you have an intangible asset called goodwill, right? And if you look at all of these things, those that impact, they really fall into that category of the strength of your contracts and the strength of your goodwill. And that intangible asset of goodwill is made up of the length of the relationships with your customers. It's made up with your relationships and the strength of your talent. And it's made up with the strength of your brand in the industry. And so, when we start to talk about action plans, right, your action plans should be to preserve and increase the value of those two assets, your contracts and your goodwill. And most of what the buyer is going to be looking at when they're going through their due diligence process to determine, whether they want to buy you, how much they want to pay when they buy you, and what the terms are going to be of that. They're going to be really looking at your contracts and your goodwill. I've got some slides I want to show, but David, I didn't know if you had any questions about that before we proceeded into some of the slides that I know.
No, let's jump through some of the slides with some of the financial information, and I've got a comment or two if we have some time at the end.
Okay, great. Great. So we can go into that. So these slides came from me from buyers or investment bankers. So this is either the way that buyers organized seller information so that they could look at it, decipher it, utilize it, or this is the way that investment bankers presented the information to buyers because investment bankers knew that this would be helpful for buyers. So again, this is kind of the end of the road of again. So the first one is what we call material customer highlights. This came from a buyer, and this is a chart that they create right away. And you'll see pretty simple chart. They have customer name, the annual revenue, percentage of the revenue it is to the total revenue of the company, the gross margin. Then they have what type of contract, is this direct or through a VMS or MSP? Then they have a customer satisfaction score. So this particular buyer is actually a PE firm that we do a lot of acquisitions for, and you'll find a lot of buyers will do this. They want to hear the voice of your customers. And they're going to require that they hear that voice. And these are the scores that the customers got when they hired a third party to go out there and talk to those customers. So then they went and they do a category called revenue synergies. This is places where they think they can pick up new business from these particular clients. So you'll see for number one, ABC Warehouse, they noted that this company is having geographic expansion, building a new facility in Indiana, and they might be able to pick up business there. And then number three, Prime Online is having geographic expansion across the Southeast. So they note that they might be able to pick up some revenue synergies there. Then they have the termination date of the contract. And then this is a very important category, controlling contact. And this is the person that they believe within the seller that controls this client. So you see Ted Williams controls 3 clients, Gloria Stefan controls 1, Hickey Freeman 1, and Chris Dior 2. So that is just an example of what buyers. So, okay, what we recommend is go out and do the same thing, right? If you don't have this information ready, create this type of chart as you go, as you're looking through, and there are certain conclusions that you can reach here that are critical conclusions that you're going to want to plan around. Next one is what they call, this came from an investment banker, customer KPI. Again, it's the customer name, it's the revenue, then it's the positions that they're filling with the customer. It's the number of annual placements, the length of the placements, the average bill rate, the revenue from the contingent workforce, and then there was some minor direct hire work that's spelled out to the right. So again, being able to run these reports, many of you already run these reports, but being able to run these reports, organize this information, understand it, see if you see any trends in it, really important. This is actually what they called, this is from a buyer, key contractual terms. So with all of the key clients, they wanted to know certain things about the contracts. So they wanted to know, first of all, how many years they've been a client, direct or VMS, which we already decided. They wanted to know if there were any special certifications that the seller had in order to obtain this client. Sometimes that could be, a disadvantaged, person qualification. It could be, if you're doing government work, a certain type of government clearance that you need, but they wanted to know if there are any special certifications that were needed to service the work, the contract term, the termination date, what the process is to renew the contract, and then what discounts or rebates, if any, were being given under the contract. The last one, voice of the customer. A lot of sellers say, well, I'm not letting a buyer talk to my customer. I think, David, this was a big debate at our conference, right? I don't remember if you remember these discussions. I think you do. I think you were part of the panel, actually. But sellers don't understand that buyers are gonna want to speak in some form or another to your customers. There's, I think, Corey Doyle, who runs White Wolf Capital, who's a big PE firm that has made a ton of investments in the staffing space, basically stated at the conference that they will not acquire a seller who won't give them access to their customer. So this is an example of one of the PE firms and the survey and what the questions they try and ask. And so what I've seen, one of our sellers who just did an incredible job preparing for sale do is, rather than let the buyer control the customer satisfaction survey, they hired their own third party, did a survey in advance of 3 months out from the sale, and just handed a report over to the buyer, which the buyer had never seen before, and was astounded by it, and fulfilled the buyer's demands for speaking to the seller. So again, these are some of the questions that buyers are going to look at when they're speaking to your customers, and lined up in the. And then the last two slides, those go to the first slides are slides that buyers look at to look at your contracts, your customer relationships. These last two slides really go towards your talent, and you probably won't have any slides similar to this. And I would encourage you, if you don't, to please start to create these type of things. One is what this PE firm called material client generation and control. And so they create this document when they're looking at a seller. And again, it's customer revenue. Then it's the lead generation activity that created this customer. It's who closed the deal, who they believe to be the controlling contact, and what team services the customer. So, and then the last slide and information that we have is, again, another PE firm gave me this, which is a chart they make of the key person and key employment terms. So you see what they do is they take all these key people and they chart out, their impact, their revenue impact on the company. So if you look at Ted Williams, revenue generated, he generated this client ABC Warehouse, they're 6.5 million. Customers he controls, well, he controls ABC Warehouse, but he also now controls Duke Lighting and Fast Delivery, and that's $12 million of revenue. And then they look at what his employment terms are. And the idea is who's important and how locked up are they? And so I've actually gone through this exercise with a couple of clients who are preparing to sell. We've done this exercise and we've reached important conclusions about steps we need to take to help secure some of the talent that's at the client. And we'd be able to put together incentive compensation plans and other items to help raise the security. But this is, really, really critical document that I know this PE firm looks at. And I've seen in deals where a PE firm will say, or a buyer will say, hey, look, Ted Williams, we're not buying you unless you can guarantee he can come and he signs our form of contract. And same thing with Hickey Freeman. We're going to want those two people to come over. And if you haven't planned for that, it might not be as easy to accomplish as you think, because what we've seen 3 or 4 years ago was a key person who realized that the owner had not tied them down. He realized that the buyer was demanding that he come as part of the transaction. And so what did he do? He leveraged the seller for quite a substantial bonus at the closing in order to agree to come over. And if that seller had been planning in advance and had done a chart similar to this in advance, no doubt that one of their professionals or the conclusion they would have reached would have been to put something in place. And I can guarantee if they'd put something in place a year or two before the transaction, they would have paid that person several $100,000 less than they had to do at the end of the transaction. So just good charts to understand what buyers are looking at, because that's the end again, and understanding how that might impact what you're doing now as you prepare for a sale.
All right, and then I think we're a little over, but I don't want to miss this last slide on just the things that can negatively impact your value.
Right, and again, I don't think I need to say too much about this. Some of these are the converse of the other, right? So if you've got downward declining revenues, that's gonna impact you negatively. Any of these items, if you've got a high customer concentration, that's gonna impact you negatively. Your financial records are a mess, that's going to impact you negatively. So a lot of these just the converse of what we said in terms of positive influences.
Marty, let's kind of bring this all home. Someone who's running their company right now, they're not yet in the market to sell. What should their action plan be?
They should put, most people have plans in place. They have plans in place for their operations and what they want to do. Part of that planning, they should start to include exit planning. They should start to know where they are. You know, what is the company worth today? Understand and start to take actions to start to impact that or preserve it. Like it's not always about, improving it. Obviously, that's the goal 9 out of 10 times, but sometimes we're just preserving and taking the steps to preserve the asset so that when we go to exit, the asset is preserved in the right condition.
Yeah, one of the points I was going to make earlier, I kind of wanted to follow up with is I had the opportunity through the Entrepreneurial Masters program last year to see a gentleman named Vern Harnish, who's the author of a book, Scaling Up. And what he talked about is he said the owner's number one job, it's not to be the chief rainmaker, it's not to be the chief manager, it's to drive the valuation of the company. So everything that Marty spent the last hour talking to you guys about, this is your role as an owner, is to figure out how do we maximize the enterprise value, whether we're selling today, selling tomorrow, or selling 10 years from now. That's your job as CEO.
Okay.
Any final parting thoughts, Marty?
No, I mean, I think some of this obviously is pretty basic, but some of it's pretty complicated, and it's just really important to understand this today, and that's why I thought this is a little bit different of a topic than when we've done M&A. Usually, it's all about the latter half of the process, not the beginning of the process. So I commend you for thinking of this topic, David, because I think that this can be very helpful to folks today, whether they're moving towards a sale in a few years or not.
Well, thank you. I appreciate the kind words. I appreciate you taking the time to talk with everybody, Marty. This is just a great overview. Did have one question come in. Can we get these slides? Yeah, they'll be on our Lunch with Haley website along with this recording. So you can hear us, or hear Marty, I should say, walking through them again. If you like, it should be up there by the beginning of next week. If you have questions about the M&A process, Marty and his company are great people to get started with. They can answer questions. They can steer you to other professional advisors, CPAs, investment bankers. And of course, they're there for legal advice to help you. You don't want to use just your regular attorney. You want to use someone who understands how to get deals done. That is one thing I took away from year 1 and year 2 of your conference is there's a big difference between having a brain surgeon and a general practitioner. And when it comes to selling your business, you're only going to do it once, hopefully like brain surgery. So you want the specialist.
You couldn't have said better, David. That's the analogy that I always use. So I thank you. Really appreciate the opportunity to come on, and I hope folks got a few takeaways from our conversation.
All right. Thanks, Marty. And thank you, everybody, for attending this Lunch with Haley webinar. I look forward to seeing you at our upcoming events. Take care today.